Many have said when they go over the games of Jose Raul Capablanca that it appears that he is doing nothing, and then in the end game, he just sort of wins. Now, my opinion on that is I have two thoughts. The first is when he's playing the top players in the world, he is definitely not doing nothing. He's making subtle improvements to his position, and then he wins because he's been playing excellent chess from the beginning to the end. But when he played some of the lesser lights, I think he might have been doing nothing. And this game is an example of that, where he essentially doesn't do much at all, yet he is still able to win. But even in doing nothing, the game is very instructive. I think you'll enjoy it. Jose Raul Capablanca has the white pieces. His opponent is Alfred Kramborg. We can assume his opponent would be a national master or FIDE master level opponent for that era. I know I have Grandmaster Capablanca, and the Grandmaster title did not exist yet, but of course he is a Grandmaster, no question about it, even at this point. D4, D5, Knight F3, Knight F6, and Capablanca plays a surprise here, Bishop F4, the London system, which was a very rare guest at the time. And in fact, even when I started playing, the London wasn't very common. The worry was that after c5, queen to b6, and the attack on this b2 pawn, black would get too much counterplay. Now we know that white has ways of dealing with that. But it's interesting to see Capablanca playing the London system. E6, E3, C5. Black attacks white center. Totally normal chess. C3 and knight to C6. Now this position appears all the time in modern chess. It appears in the game of Magnus Carlsen and other top players. There's nothing new under the sun here. Capablanca plays the move bishop to d3. These days, knight b to d2 is the more common choice, giving some flexibility to the f1 bishop. But he plays bishop to d3. This does lend some control over the e4 square. It could also attack h7 in some positions. Black plays bishop to d6, offering to trade off his good bishop for white's bad bishop. Bad because it's the central pawns are on the same color. But black also knows that when he gets a queen on d6, he'll be able to advance in the center. Most common these days is bishop to g3, maintaining the tension. But Capablanca does something here that you see throughout this entire game. Pretty much every time he gets a chance to exchange pieces, he does it. He always wants to exchange pieces. He wants to get to that endgame, and he pretty much every time he can, he does, and he takes on d6 in this position. Queen takes d6, and now knight b to d2, and black plays e5. Black has a completely equal game. This move gains space in the center and frees the bishop at c8. It's no longer blocked in by the pawn at e6. Black is fine. Pawn takes, knight takes, and now the second exchange. Capablanca gets an opportunity to exchange. He just exchanges off the pieces. We don't see deep strategic thought particularly at this moment. Takes, takes. Now bishop to b5, check. Obviously, black doesn't want to move the king and lose castling privileges. So that forces him to interpose a piece, which allows Capablanca to exchange off more pieces, which he does. Bishop to d7. Now he plays queen to a4, building up tension. This keeps black from castling for the moment. Queen to c7. And now Capablanca makes an interesting decision. The safest decision here was to just castle short and then play rook to d1. But instead he plays long castling. Now the rook is already on the d file, aiming at this d5 pawn. But I think he anticipates the exchange of queens. In that case, castling long is better because the rook is already on its ideal square. Black goes ahead and castles. Bishop takes d7, again exchanging off those pieces. It would be a blunder for black to take with the queen here, because after queens come off, Capablanca would have this very nice move, knight to e4, taking advantage of the pin down the d file. If he takes the knight, then he plays rook takes knight, gets his rook on the 7th. Otherwise, how does black save a pawn? The only move to save a pawn right now is actually f5, hitting that knight a second time. But after knight to d6, it's double attack, hitting the b7 pawn and the d5 pawn, and white would be winning. So black is forced to take with his knight at d7. Now knight to f3. The rook attacks the d5 pawn. And here, if black plays knight to f6, he's actually probably a little bit better. He's got more space, and his king is a bit safer. So Capablanca didn't do much, and black has a fine position here, but he doesn't make this move. Instead, he plays queen to c6, offering the exchange of queens, and we know exactly what Capablanca will do in this situation. He didn't even think twice, I'm sure, and took off that queen and pawn takes. So black has a slight pawn structure weakness here in the center, but it's hardly the end of the world. This is a perfectly playable position for black. The real problem for black is how good Capablanca is at the end game. That's the real challenge. Capablanca plays knight to d2. The normal strategic idea is to play c4 or e4 in these positions. Knight to e5. Black is threatening knight to d3 check, followed by knight takes f2, winning that pawn and forking those rooks. So king to c2. Capablanca keeps the knight out of the d3 square, but c4, so the knight can land on d3. So he just very calmly plays rook h to f1 so that the f2 pawn is defended if the knight were to move in to this square. Really doing very little, very little. f5, white gains space, and what does Capablanca do? Offers the exchange of the knights. Let's just exchange those knights and get them off of the board. Knight takes f3, g takes f3, and now Capablanca has some slight pawn weaknesses of his own, but this is a pure rook end game. And I would venture to say even a modern player rated 1800 could get into this type of position against a similar level opponent. Capablanca has done nothing special up to this point in time. Rook a to e8. Black sets up this move f4, so Capablanca plays rook to d4 to help control the f4 square. But after this, black forgets about the f4 move. He can actually play f4 here, and after e4, it's a fairly equal position. But instead, he plays the rook to f6. b3, Capablanca attacks this central pawn at c4. Pawn takes, pawn takes. Now, if you put this in a computer, the evaluation doesn't change after b3, but if you look at it with our eyes, we can see black has a little less space, and Capablanca has this half-open a file that he can work on to attack this a7 pawn. King to f7, black gets his king activated. King to d3, same thing. Rook to e7, a passive move. Not a bad move, but it's passive. He's defending the pawn laterally, so now Capablanca can press against it, and black will have to be on the defensive. Rook to a1, he does exactly that, attacking the pawn. Now king to e6. Now, we like to get our kings activated in the endgame, but there still can be some danger. And this king has to be a little careful, even with queens and so many pieces off of the board. Black's king can be a problem, actually. Rook to a6 illustrates this, not only attacking the c6 pawn, but there's now a pin on that pawn aiming at the king. And rook to c7. And this rook is beginning to get a little overloaded, right? It's defending a7 and c6. It's no big deal, but it's just a little bit more pressure. Rook d to a4, doubling against the pawn at a7. Now, here, rook f to f7 looks natural enough, right? Defending the a7 pawn a second time. The problem is after f4, black is way too passive, and Capablanca could break through. Let's say rook f to e7. Now b4 with the threat of b5, taking advantage of this pin on the 6th rank. If the king moves out of that pin, then just rook to a5 with the idea of rook to c5, and then b5 would completely shatter black's pawn structure. f4 is still the strongest idea for black, but it looks like he had like a mental block with playing that move. After rook takes a7, rook's exchanged, pawn takes. Capablanca would have to take with his king, otherwise he'd lose the f3 pawn, and Capablanca would be up a pawn, but the kingside pawns are a little too weak here, and black certainly has an equal endgame. So instead, black plays the move g5, gaining some space, and Capablanca finds a way to nibble and create a slight weakness, h4. If black takes the pawn, then after rook h4, black would have pawn weaknesses all over the board. So instead, he plays g4, and Capablanca would like to take twice on g4, but then his f2 pawn would hang. So he just brings the king back to defend that pawn. Now he is threatening to take on g4. So gf3 check, king f3, and now black has a couple of new weaknesses, one at f5, one at h7. The rook comes back to f7. Now, Capablanca could have played king to f4. That was a more aggressive move, but he plays the king back to e2. King to d6. Again, f4 is the best idea for black. After pawn takes king to f5, he's starting to get some activity. This is probably still equal. King to d6 was played instead, and here Capablanca could have played f4, but instead he plays b4, again with this threat of breaking up the pawns with b5. The rook goes to b7 to help control the b5 square. Now h5, and here, this was Black's last chance to play f4. After ef4, rook b to e7 check, Black probably has enough activity to survive. But instead he makes a blunder. He plays the move h6. Not only does this make it almost impossible for Black to get at the h5 pawn, it also creates a weakness on g6 that Capablanca can exploit. f4 was finally played, and now there's no way f4 is going to be played by Black, and the f5 pawn is fixed as a weakness. Rook to g7, threatening to check down the g-file. King moves to d3, rook goes back, rook to a1, rook g7, king d4, rook g2. And by the way, Black is actually threatening mate in 1 with rook to d2. So Capablanca brings the other rook back, offering the exchange of another piece, a rook in this case. Rook to g3 is a computer line. It's actually pretty impressive. No human, I think, would find this. The idea is the rook is threatening to go to e7 and attack the e3 pawn. If taking on a7, the rooks come off. Then rook to g1, threatening mate by rook to d1, so the king would come back. Then rook to d1 check, forcing the king over. And then rook to h1 attacks the pawn at h5. And after rook a6, rook takes pawn b5, king to c5. Black's passed h-pawn and slightly more active king give him chances to hold this position. But instead he plays the rook b to g7. The king comes back to d3. And now we're left with one pair of one rook for each side. Rook to e7, rook to g2, threatening to come into that hook, or that weak square, at g6 that we mentioned earlier. Rook to e6 to help control that square and keep White's rook out. But now rook to g7 attacks the a7 pawn. Rook to e7 blocks it, but rook to g8. What Capablanca wants to do is to play the rook to h8, attack the h6 pawn, and then when Black plays rook to e6, play rook to h7. So the rook at h7 would attack a7 and h6. So c5 is played by Black, trying to create some friction in the position. But rook to g6 check, rook to e6, pawn takes check, and obviously the king cannot take the pawn because he would lose the rook. So he plays the king back to d7, the rook to g7 check, king to c6, and now Capablanca gets the a7 pawn. King takes c5, but now here's the final blow from Jose Raul Capablanca, rook to f7. And there's simply no way to defend the f5 pawn, and Black's position is lost, and he resigned. So maybe he didn't do absolutely nothing, but he did very little. And in the end of the day, his superior endgame skills were enough to win the game. I hope you enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.